morning. I got here right after the power went out, and there were students pouring into the parking lot. So, if you don't know, the power was out for a while this morning. And it either fortunately or unfortunately came back on. So, I was contemplating holding class in the dark in here. We've been talking about the 1950s in here. And at the end of World War II, as I pointed out earlier, there was a fear that there would be a post-war recession. One, there usually is a recession after a major war. And secondly, they were afraid that when the government stopped spending all the money on the war, we would slide back into the Great Depression. For a variety of reasons, that doesn't happen. In fact, instead of depression, there's an economic boom and the economy takes off. The gross national product, the GNP, in 1940 was at 100 billion. The GNP is the culmination of all the goods and services produced in that country in a year. So it's 100 billion in 1940, it's 210 billion in 1946, and by 1952, it's 347 billion. Inflation averaged only around 3%, and unemployment only around 2.5%. It does hit close to 6% a few years after the war, but that's an anomaly. By and large, throughout the 50s, unemployment's low and inflation is low. And as I pointed out, there are several reasons for this. People had money. Remember, they had made a lot of money during the war, but there wasn't a whole lot to buy. Things were rationed. Secondly, the U.S. had most of the world market to itself. The other great industrial powers, Britain, France, Germany, were still basically parking lots. It's going to take years for their economies to recover. So American business largely has a world market to itself. The third, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail, the GI Bill, the benefits package for the returning veterans of World War II. That's going to help not spark the economic boom so much, but help sustain it and expand it. And fourth, the baby boom. There's something else that was pent up and frustrated, not just economic power. You got close to 16 million servicemen returning during World War II. So there's a lot of lost time to make up for. A lot of people immediately started families. In fact, you see the origins of the baby boom late in World War II. You already start seeing a rise in the number of live births in the country. In 1933, for example, there were 2.3 million live births in the United States. That was pretty typical. By 1947, there were over 3.8 million, and by the 1950s, it averages over 4 million a year. In fact, it's closer to 4 million in the last half of the 50s. I happen to be a product of the baby Now, you might imagine it has a huge impact on the economy. It impacts construction, especially at first. There is a shortage of new homes. So people are desperately trying to build new homes. And as I'll point out, this is also the birth, really, of the suburbs. Secondly, you got to build maternity hospitals. People are having babies left and right. You need schools, K through 12 schools. You need a lot of services. Before you had Huggies and things like that, you had two choices. You either wash the diapers out yourself, which is sort of like handling radioactive material, except grosser, or you could hire a baby service. And they'd pick them up, clean them, and bring them back. Things like that started booming in the 50s. A lot of services related to child care are booming. To make a good living in medicine back then, become a pediatrician. That was the key. Today, I guess it's somebody that specializes in geriatric medicine. The toy industry booms. All these kids. The baby food industry booms. And within a generation, it begins to impact higher education. As the first baby boomers are entering college, you see a great expansion of the college systems. Something that started with the GI Bill. So you need more schools, more teachers aides, more staff. And this gives you some idea of the baby boom. Here's a number of live births right around the beginning of World War II. And if you look at it, its peak years, from 1955 to about 1960. And this was typical in probably every hospital across America. Sometimes they didn't have enough room for all the kids in the maternity hospitals. Now, the baby boom's one thing that boosts the economy. The other is the GI Bill. It's officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, and it's passed by Congress in 1944, even before the war is over. One of the reasons they passed it was to try and prevent a Great Depression. They were really worried about the consequences of millions of men returning home and looking for jobs. That was the problem after World War I. They had no programs to ease the returning veterans back into civilian life, and they demobilized them as fast as they could. So they dumped hundreds of thousands of men every month on the economy. And it did lead to a post-war recession after World War I. Didn't last very long. They were afraid of that, so they thought the GI Bill would help soften some of that impact. It's going to do a lot more than that, folks. Talking about the 1950s days. It offers unprecedented educational and economic benefits to World War II veterans. You could get 52 weeks of unemployment at $20 a month, and that's not a whole lot back then, but it was enough to live on. And most veterans averaged about 19 or 20 weeks on federal assistance before they found a job. So again, it wasn't that easy. And keep in mind, a lot of these guys are coming back beat up, not just physically, but a lot of them have what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. So it takes them a while to readjust. You get a low-interest home loan, and over 4 million GIs apply for one of those. It helps a lot of people get their first home. Nearly 8 million veterans use the GI Bill for education or training. About 30% of those eligible will use it to go to college. Veterans received $500 in tuition. That would go a long way today, wouldn't it? What would that cover, about 6 credit hours or something? Not even that. Back then, that was enough to attend a school like UC or NKU or Louisville or something like that. Is it going to get you into Harvard? No. That was extremely expensive even back then. But the $500 in tuition was enough to get you into a good state school. You also got $50 a month living expenses, and it was more if you were married. This is going to have a dramatic impact on higher education. Before World War II, a classroom like this, you wouldn't have seen this. To begin with, you wouldn't have seen most of you ladies in here. Probably wouldn't have seen, in some colleges, any of you. It was male only. The Ivy League was male only up until the 1960s. So you couldn't even go to Harvard or Columbia or Cornell or anything like that. Secondly, it tended to be middle to upper class that went to college. You would not have seen students wearing jeans or professors wearing jeans for that matter back then. It was a lot more rigid, a lot more formal. The incoming GIs, they're not there for the experience, quite frankly. They don't care about pledging fraternities and, going to the sophomore dance or any of that crap. They want to get an education. Many of them got families. This is business. So it did a lot to tear down the stuffy attitude. And a lot of the traditional for freshmen to wear little beanies. How many of you guys want to wear little beanies running around? That's what the returning veterans thought. And anybody that tried to make them a beanie usually found it stuffed in a very uncomfortable place. So it really helped change and democratize higher education. For the first time, you really saw working class students getting and being able to afford a college education. Now, something else that's changing America in the 50s, much like radio had changed the 20s, 50s is really the dawn of the television age. Now, television has really been around since the 1920s. If you count a very tiny screen about this big that's very hazy and you can barely see anything. But the technology existed. In fact, literally, right before World War II broke out, BBC in England, British Broadcasting Corps, began regular television broadcast. And it lasted about a month when the war came, and that got shut down. There had been a lot of experimental television broadcasts in America before that. It was even featured at the World's Fair the world of the future, and they had television there. For once, they got it right. But we were about to start commercial broadcasting when the war came. So it wasn't until 1948 that you began to see commercial broadcast. You only had a couple of networks. You had NBC, CBS, and what was the third? The DuPont network. Yeah, that only lasted like 3 or 4 years. Collapsed. But also, by that point, ABC had decided to get into the television business. Yeah. They owned a string of radio stations, and they thought they'd start their TV network, and it didn't really work out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, either without the little propeller or not, yeah. Some of them did. Now, the TV was only on from like 10 o'clock in the morning to maybe 10 o'clock at night. After the evening news, all you got was test patterns. Folks probably don't even remember what a test pattern looks like. But it began to take off very quickly. Now, many of the early shows had been radio shows. Good, we're talking about the 50s. Many of the earliest television shows were simply radio shows that had been, transferred to television. But 1951, the first really big TV hit debuts on television. In fact, you can still see reruns of it. Somewhere, almost every minute, the show is actually still going on. Anybody know what it is? It was arguably the most successful show in television.
Is it an Andy Griffin show or whatever?
No, that was later. No, not Lassie. No, MASH was much later. Think early TV. No, they did take Gunsmoke originated on the radio. That wasn't as big a hit when it first hit television.
Oh, the radio.
This was a show that was never on the radio. Way to go!
Oh.
That, yes, I Love Lucy. Ricky, that stuff. That was the first huge smash on TV. It was on, I think, on Tuesday nights, and you could tell because people going out to the movies plummeted on Tuesdays. You get a front row seat in any movie theater. It was that popular. By the way, the show almost never debuted. You know why? Yeah, by then it was rerun. Yeah. You know why it almost never went on TV? This tells you a whole lot about America in the 50s.
Probably because Ricky wasn't there.
Thank you.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You got it. By the way, here's an early television. Not quite your modern flat screen, is it? Yeah, he's Cuban. And they didn't think white America would buy a mixed marriage between a Latino and a white woman. And really they managed to convince him. They even went around on a road show and was highly popular. But he almost never got to star in his own show because of that. A lot of racism in the 50s. By 1960, there were now over 67 million televisions in the United States. Now I think there's 670 million. I'm not kidding. Now this really impacts the movie industry. I mean, they had a monopoly on this kind of stuff until commercial TV debuted in 1948. So they had to change the type of movies they were presenting to try and get business. They were afraid this was going to kill the movie industry. This is when you get the big Panavision 3-4 hour long epics from the 50s. Things like Ben-Hur, Cleopatra and all that. They're trying to create an experience you couldn't get on television. They use that widescreen format, the Panavision, the 70 millimeter, the bright colors with CinemaScope. And again, it's reflective of the 1950s, the themes they picked for these movies. Remember, this is the height of the Red Scare in America. A lot of things are controversial. So most of these big budget epics tend to be safe topics, normally biblical. You got the Ten Commandments, you got, Ben-Hur, things like that. Hey, with Easter coming up, every one of them is going to show up on TV again, right? They almost always show the Ten Commandments right around Easter. And it still impacts the movie industry today. Here's a billboard from the Ten Commandments. Got damn near every star in Hollywood back then in a minute. And Ben-Hur. And probably the guy that benefited most from doing these epics, Charlton Heston. I don't even remember who he is. Yeah, the original Planet of the Apes movies. But he made a fortune in the 50s doing these, as they call them in Hollywood, sword and sandal movies. Now, if you got a baby boom, sooner or later you're going to have a rise in youth culture. And again, the 1950s and future decades are going to be shaped by the rise of youth culture in America. Now, some aspects of it, and by the way, I mean for youth culture, a generation that has markedly different taste and outlook than its predecessors. So a lot of the baby boomers don't necessarily share the same outlook and values of their parental generation. Now, there were some aspects of it before World War II. The so-called Bobby Soxers, young women that basically just adored crooners such as Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby. Yes, there was a time they were both young. But what really helps change it is the urbanization of America, the prosperity of America in the 50s, technology, and the sheer number of teenagers growing up. By 1956, there were over 13 million teenagers. That's 26% more than just 3 years earlier. And unlike previous generations, they had disposable income. They had in their pockets they could spend basically on luxury goods. Teenagers in previous generations didn't have that advantage. My father grew up during the Great Depression. Whatever money he made went to the family kitty to help support the family. He didn't have disposable income. By the 1950s, teenagers have over $7 billion a year in disposable income. That averaged out to between 10 and 11 bucks a week, which doesn't sound like squat today. But that was as much as the average family had just 10 years earlier. So you've got a lot of buying power. And what are they going to spend it on? They're going to invest it in stocks and bonds. What do you guys spend your money on? You don't. You save it all. Stuff your mattress with it. Or you don't make any money, you're all dead broke and living on welfare.
Food.
Huh?
I'm just joking. But that is,
No, I think that was Freudian. I think that was, huh?
Huh?
No.
Same thing.
Clothes, music, things like that.
So fighting, no, just looking good.
It always is when you're young. Then you pay the piper later. Along with the rise of this youth generation is a new form of music. Rock and roll. It's rebellious. It challenges racial mores in America. And it's slightly dirty. It's a synthesis of basically multicultural music. It's got its bases in black rhythm and blues, white country and western. You throw in a little jazz, you throw in a little folk music. And it's played on a relatively new instrument, the electric guitar. That, again, is kind of a post-war phenomenon. The earliest electric guitar emerged in the 1930s. Any of you folks get to go down to the museum center when they had the guitar show down there? See, I had to go down to see that because they had a copy of the first guitar ever made. First electric guitar ever. Rickenbacker frying pan. Yes, folks, that is the absolute first electric guitar in history. It gets perfected, and after World War II, companies like Rickenbacker, Gibson, who could forget the Les Paul, Fender, start producing relatively inexpensive electric guitars. You go, Fender Stratocaster for only a couple of $100. That's still expensive, but it was relatively cheap compared to a lot of other guitars. So you got a new type of music played with a new type of instrument, and it goes under a lot of different names. It's known as rockabilly, race music, and others. But it was a disc jockey in Cleveland, Ohio, Alan Freed, that gave it its famous name. He used an old blues term for sex, rock and roll. In fact, some of the earliest songs that have rock and roll in the title are actually blues songs from the 1930s. Like gonna rock and roll you all night, things like that. It was perfect. It was slightly dirty. The parents had no idea what it meant. And it quickly took off, and this new music became known as rock and roll. And of course, the guy that revolutionizes it. There are a lot of early pioneers. Here's the guy that named it, actually. But here's the guy that became the first true international superstar. His dancing was considered so provocative that when he was first on television, they refused to show him from the waist down. Yes, folks, it was a simpler age. Now, in many ways, these phenomenon help shape our conception of the 50s. But the 50s also had its dark sides. Despite the superficial conformity, the rise of suburbs, things like that, there's a lot of anxiety and change seen underneath society. The fear of atomic warfare, for example. That's expressed a lot. That, and by the way, space travel. Remember in 1957, Russia launches Sputnik. So the 1950s are an age where people are wondering about both the threat of atomic warfare and contacting other alien species. And usually, given our previous experiences, we assume that's going to be hostile. So you begin to see an explosion of B-grade science fiction movies in the 1950s. The very early precursors to Star Wars, basically, without the good special effects. But they represent society's fears in the 50s of atomic warfare and invasion by aliens. Here's a good one for you. Not of this earth. Or, and by the way, a lot of them, you have to have a brave hero and a beautiful heroine. So almost all of them have some sort of beautiful woman being kidnapped. In the poster, yeah. Well, who usually goes to these things? Young males. So, here's another example. How's that for excellent special effects? Scares the heck out of you. But not all of them were cheap E-graders. This one was actually one of the best movies ever made. It's based loosely on The Tempest. And it also introduces one of the most famous TV robots in history, Robbie the Robot. But anyway, these movies reflect America's fears of what's going to happen with the space race and atomic warfare. Now, something else that's fermenting under the surface in the 50s is a burgeoning civil rights movement in America. There were essentially two Americas in the 1950s. One white, the other black, largely segregated, and kept poor. Slavery ended in the United States in 1865, but despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the government had really African American rights. And the southern states, after Reconstruction ended, of so-called Jim Crow laws, was legalized segregation, separation of the races. And they were allowed to legally do this. In 1896, the Supreme Court, in its dubious wisdom, in a case known as Plessy versus Ferguson, ruled that, quote, separate but equal was legal. Otherwise, you could separate the races as long as the facilities were equal. Now, the truth of the matter is they were never equal. The services for African Americans were always markedly inferior. And here's just a typical case. Here's two water fountains. There's a modern cold one where you get cold water, and here's the old-fashioned kind. By the 1950s, the South in particular had very rigid segregation. In the North, places like New York, New England, legalized segregation had ended. You still find a lot of informal segregation, especially in school systems, but a lot of places have ended legal segregation in the North. Not all of them, by the way. But to give you an idea of some of the laws, in almost every southern state, schools were segregated, whites were prevented from hiring African Americans, things like that. But a lot of states had some really wacky ones. In Alabama, it was illegal for whites and blacks to play pool or billiards together. In Georgia, black barbers were not allowed to cut white hair. Kentucky segregated reform schools. We don't want our juvenile delinquents hanging out together, do we? North Carolina segregated textbooks. Mississippi made it against the law. It was a fine of $500 and 6 months in jail for printing, publishing, or advocating equality between the races or the right for the races to intermarry. It was against the law to argue that. In Alabama, a white person and a black person could not play checkers together in public. I mean, we all know what that leads to, right? Actually, I'm not sure what that leads to. And my personal favorite, New Orleans segregated prostitutes, even though prostitution was illegal. You can't do it, but all the black hookers over here, and all the white ones over here, but it's illegal. Many restaurants, in fact almost every restaurant in the South, was either whites only or they had, quote, white and colored sections. And these are a couple of signs very typical. These are signs from a Florida restaurant. Notice the top one. No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans. It was very typical. If you had two restrooms, they were obviously segregated. And if you bothered to serve African Americans, they were usually seated in a separate room in the rear of the restaurant. Now, African Americans have been fighting back against these injustices pretty much since the Jim Crow laws have been passed. In 1909, numerous prominent African American and white leaders formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And back in 1909, colored was considered a polite and appropriate way of addressing African Americans. Today it would be considered somewhat racist, wouldn't it? Or your 95-year-old great-grandmother using it. But back then it was considered an acceptable term. There were largely middle and upper class African Americans and white supporters.
and they tended to shun away from what we call direct action. That's demonstrations, sit-ins, protests, things like that. One, they thought it was counterproductive. It would just bring on more white hostility. And back then it was probably true. And secondly, it probably would have led to a rise in lynchings in the South. The early 20th century was the worst time in American history for lynchings. So they tended to shy away from direct action. Instead, they tended to try political and, more important, litigative action, legal action. One of their lawyers, they had their own legal arm, and became an extremely good legal team. One of their lawyers, Charles Hamilton Houston, one of the great unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. Houston and others had the flaw in legalized segregation. After all, what did Place say mandate? Separate but equal was okay as long as what? What did I say? Yeah, thank you. As long as it's still equal. Well, it's never equal. So he came up with the tactic of, fine, if you're going to have separate but equal, we're going to sue the states and make sure the facilities are equal. Knowing damn well it would cost way too much money to do that. They would have no other choice but to desegregate the institutions. So that became the strategy of the NAACP beginning in the 1930s up through the 50s. Sue the states under Place for, quote, separate but equal. And when they couldn't provide equal facilities, the court's going to strike down the segregation laws. They start with higher education. And they win a series of victories. They're also suing over a few other things, but education becomes their focus. In 1938, they win the case Gaines versus Missouri. Missouri's law school had to admit African Americans because they did not provide a separate law school for blacks. Far from being separate but unequal, there was nothing. So the Supreme Court ruled, well, Missouri now has to allow African Americans in their universities. And in 1950, they successfully sued the state of Texas in a case known as Sweat versus Painter. The plaintiff, a guy named Painter, wanted to get a law degree in Texas, and they didn't have a law school for African Americans. So they started one. It was in the basement of the white school. It had a part-time faculty and a few hand-me-down books. That was it. And the court ruled against the state of Texas. They said that in no way equaled the white law school in the state of Texas. And there were other cases, McLaren versus Oklahoma, Murray versus Maryland. They all helped establish a precedent. Now, the team of lawyers, and there were both black and white lawyers at the NAACP, they decided it was time to shift emphasis from higher education and selective cases to trying to bring down separate but equal altogether in education. They had decided they had won enough precedents to do this. Oh, here's a few more racist signs. Coca-Cola machine. Notice it's only 6 cents. And notice it's for white customers only. Yeah, today we definitely see it as bad business. How's that for bad business? We wash for white people only. And you know what? Based on Southern hiring practices, I guarantee you most of the people in that place actually doing the laundry were black. Here's two of the founders of the NAACP, Joel Spingarn, and their achievement medal today is still named after him. By the way, notice he was a progressive, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And they do have some demonstrations. Here's an anti-lynching one in New York. Now, at that time, the NAACP had 5 separate cases in front of the Supreme Court, all dealing with the same issue: desegregation in K through 12 groups. Now, a lot of times when the court has multiple cases and they all hinge roughly on the same evidence and the same decision, they'll roll them all together and then just roll on the one case, and that will solve all 5. So that's what they do with this. They get 5 similar cases, so they roll them into one big case. And they do it alphabetically and take the name of the lead plaintiff, the first one alphabetically. And that happens to be a gentleman by the name of Oliver Brown, who's suing on behalf of his 8-year-old daughter. She lives only 3 blocks away from a brand new but all-white elementary school, and instead had to cross about 2 miles of busy street, railroad tracks, and other obstacles. So he sues on her behalf. And the case becomes known as Brown versus Board. Now, the Supreme Court first hears the case in 1952. But the Chief Justice at the time, Fred Vinson, was somewhat of a racist and segregationist, realized this case was controversial as hell, and really didn't want to rule on it. So he stalled. And then that summer, he drops dead from a massive heart attack. Some people actually believe the case helped bring it on. So that meant the incoming president, Eisenhower, could do something few presidents really get a chance to do: name a Chief Justice. A lot of presidents, if they're in there long enough, get to name an associate justice or 2, but very few get a chance to name a Chief Justice. Now, Eisenhower is going to pick a guy from California, Earl Warren. Warren had been Attorney General of California, had been governor, and he wasn't named to the court because he was the greatest legal genius in the country. You can dispel that notion right now that the 9 people on the court are the best jurists in the country. No, they're on there largely for political reasons. And Earl Warren was chosen largely for political reasons. He was picked basically for two reasons. One, Eisenhower mistakenly thought he was a conservative. And two, to get him out of California. Earl Warren, at least in California politics, was Richard Nixon's biggest rival. The two pretty much hated each other. So to do Nixon a favor, he basically got Warren out of California. Ironically, Warren will go on to be considered one of the most liberal and one of the greatest Chief Justices in American history. Years later, when they asked Eisenhower what his worst mistake as president was, he didn't hesitate. He replied, naming Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. Most historians and legal experts disagree with him on that. Earl Warren had the NAACP re-argue the case. And they didn't just bring in legal arguments, they brought in historical, sociological arguments, psychological arguments. Here's Charles Hamilton Houston. Literally worked himself to death. That's why he didn't argue Brown himself. Brown was actually argued by his star pupil, Thurgood Marshall. And as you probably know, he will go on to be the first African-American Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. Here's Marshall with two of the other lawyers. And here's Dr. Kenneth Clark. One of the experts they brought in to testify was Dr. Clark. And he had done a revolutionary experiment using black and white children and dolls. It's a very simple experiment. He showed both of them, a black doll and a white doll, and asked them which one, quote, was the pretty doll, end quote. And you would expect a well-adjusted child of either race to pick their own race as the pretty doll. And what Dr. Clark found out was disturbing, that even at a young age, a lot of these young African-American kids had such a low opinion of themselves, saw themselves as inferior already, that they picked the white doll. Helped demonstrate a lot of the psychological damage that segregation and Jim Crow can do to someone. It was arguments like this and others that helped convince the court. And by the way, the counter-argument, all they did was rely on play-setting. That turned out to be a huge mistake, given all the other precedents that have been established. Now, as usual, it takes the court a few months but on the 5th of May, 1954, Supreme Court decides 9-0 to strike down segregation in schools. In the words of Chief Justice Warren, who wrote the majority decision, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So the court strikes down Plessy versus Ferguson with the Brown decision. Now that's a huge victory. By the way, if you're a segregationist, this is known as Black Monday. Now, unfortunately, the original decision offered no guidance on how this was to be done or how fast it was to be accomplished. in a follow-up decision known as Brown 2, the court will rule that this has to be done in, quote, all deliberate speed. Define that. Yeah, nobody knew. That's the problem. Does it mean within a year? Does it mean within a lifetime? Southern states are going to use that to stall.
WFE is the correct exact.
Well, it was vague is the problem. It gave no specific direction. And there's going to be a fight over it. And we'll look at that fight on Friday. And we'll probably even start with electricity on Friday.